I are struggling to cope with the impact of bullying, family breakdown and more.
Masks demands first fault lines. I remember the way Camilla framed it as if it were a polite request spoken with the softness of a smile and the cadence of routine. Yet the words carried an edge I could not mistake. She wanted Catherine's sapphire tiara, the one often associated with Diana, to be loaned for an upcoming banquet. In that moment at Windsor, the air shifted. What should have been an ordinary preparation for ceremony became the first crack in a mask that Camilla had spent decades perfecting. Camilla's mask was always her greatest defense. For years, she had cultivated an image of warmth and ordinariness, smiling at children during literacy events, embracing causes that felt safe, projecting a maternal steadiness beside Charles. Reuters once described her as the indispensable partner, while the BBC chronicled her slow rehabilitation from tabloid villain to accepted Queen Consort. That mask of composure had carried her through storms. But behind it, I began to see something sharper: an instinct for leverage, a willingness to press her advantage even within the family. The tiara was not just an ornament. It was heavy with history tied to Diana's legacy and Catherine's role as her daughter-in-law. It had appeared at state occasions where Catherine's presence symbolized continuity between past and future. To demand it was to tamper with a symbol too loaded to treat casually. Catherine's face revealed the strain instantly. Her lips tightened, her eyes flickered downward, and though she nodded politely, the unease was unmistakable. She knew as I did that this was no simple matter of borrowing jewels. It was an assertion of dominance cloaked in civility. William entered shortly after, sensing the tension in the room. His expression hardened when he realized what had transpired. The civility between him and Camilla had always been cautious, but this moment redrew boundaries. For William, Catherine was not just his wife, she was the guardian of his mother's legacy, a living bridge to Diana. To see her pressured into surrendering something so symbolic was intolerable. His silence at first was more powerful than any rebuke, but when his voice finally came, it carried a sharpness that stripped the smile from Camilla's lips. Looking back, I see how this demand revealed more than Camilla perhaps intended. It showed how she used politeness as pressure, how the mask of warmth concealed a calculus of power. In public, her smile softened suspicion. In private, it was a tool to disarm resistance. The tiara incident was not about jewelry, it was about influence, about testing how far she could press her authority within a family that had tolerated but never fully embraced her. Staff who witnessed the exchange understood it instantly. Their whispers afterward carried the weight of dismay. They had long known that Camilla's survival depended on endurance and subtlety, but forcing Catherine into such a corner shattered the illusion of quiet harmony. It exposed the fault lines within the palace between tradition and ambition, between memory and survival, between the future represented by William and Catherine, and the past embodied by Camilla. International coverage would later seize on the symbolism. The Guardian framed it as a clash over ownership of legacy, while Al Jazeera bluntly described it as a struggle for Diana's shadow. Polling from YouGov already showed younger Britons favoring William and Catherine overwhelmingly, while Camilla's acceptance remained fragile. In that context, her demand for the tiara felt less like formality and more like trespass. For me, Windsor became the moment I could no longer view Camilla's smile without suspicion. The mask had cracked, and behind it I saw the instinct to dominate even at the cost of family trust. The tiara gleaming under palace lights was no longer just a jewel. It was the mirror that reflected the first clear fault lines between endurance and overreach, between civility and confrontation, power protocol and a tiara. The moment Catherine yielded her tiara reluctantly, and under the weight of Camilla's insistence, I realized we had entered territory far more consequential than jewelry. In monarchy, nothing is ever just an ornament. Every jewel carries with it centuries of meaning, stories etched into diamonds, sapphires, and pearls. The tiara Camilla demanded was no exception. It had been worn by Diana, symbolizing not only elegance, but the bond between the late princess and the crown she both served and challenged. To place that tiara on Camilla's head was to rewrite that symbolism, if only for an evening. Protocol around royal jewels is strict yet nuanced. Pieces designated as crown property belong to the monarchy, as an institution accessible for state occasions. others remain personal gifts inherited or passed down, carrying a weight that is as emotional as it is ceremonial. Catherine's sapphire tiara straddled these boundaries. While technically part of the royal collection, its association with Diana and its frequent use by Catherine made it hers in practice, if not in law. To pressure her into surrendering it blurred the line between protocol and personal dignity, turning a matter of heritage into a contest of will. Camilla, of course, understood these nuances. She had spent decades navigating the labyrinth of palace rules, using her mastery of soft influence to bend them when needed. But this time, her use of protocol as leverage was unmistakable. She framed her demand as tradition, as if the order of precedence gave her the natural right to the jewel. Yet the reality was harsher tradition had never been invoked this way before. It was less about continuity than about consolidating her place at the apex of ceremonial life, even if it meant stripping Catherine of agency. William recognized this immediately. His voice, calm but edged with steel, reminded the room that protocol exists to serve the institution, not to undermine the dignity of its members. Catherine's silence was equally powerful. She had yielded, but her unease was plain for all to see. In that silence lay the cost of Camilla's ambition. A woman praised internationally for her poise was left diminished, her autonomy curtailed. Mainstream outlets later framed the issue with precision. Reuters wrote that symbols matter as much as laws in monarchy, highlighting how even small gestures can alter public perception of legitimacy. The Guardian emphasized the generational divide, noting how William and Catherine embody modernity, while Camilla represents survival through compromise. Deutsche Welle pointed out that Diana's shadow lingered in every jewel once associated with her, making any transfer fraught with meaning. The tiara was no longer just a crown of gems, it was a battlefield. Public sentiment reflected this reading. Polls showed renewed sympathy for Catherine, whose composure resonated with younger audiences. Camilla's defenders argued she acted within her rights as Queen Consort, yet their arguments felt brittle. Al Jazeera described the incident as a contest between tradition and empathy, underscoring the broader question: should authority be exercised because it can be, or withheld out of respect for those it affects? I could not escape the thought that Camilla's choice revealed something deeper about her instincts. She had spent decades enduring suspicion and hostility, outlasting scandal through patience. But endurance had hardened into entitlement. By forcing Catherine into submission, she crossed from survival into overreach, confusing access with ownership, tradition with possession. The tiara, gleaming on her head that night, symbolized not harmony, but fracture. The staff felt it too. Their whispers carried a tone of dismay, not just at the act itself, but at what it represented: a consort who wielded protocol as a weapon, rather than a shield, who placed personal assertion above the unity the monarchy so desperately needs. And in that realization, the palace felt heavier, its ceremonies less seamless, its symbols tainted by the weight of private discord. The tiara was returned, of course, polished and untouched, but the fracture it revealed could not be polished away. It remained invisible but unhealed, a reminder that even the brightest jewel can cast the darkest shadow when wielded without restraint, confrontation, and the cost of ambition. When William finally confronted Camilla, the air inside Windsor felt like stone pressing against our lungs. He did not raise his voice, he never needed to, but his tone carried the unshakable weight of a man defending both his wife and his mother's legacy. He asked plainly why Catherine had been cornered into surrendering a tiara that was more than an ornament, a piece that had come to symbolize continuity between Diana and the future of the crown. Camilla's defense was swift, her words dressed in the language of duty and ceremony. She insisted it was tradition that as Queen Consort, she had precedence, that appearances before foreign dignitaries demanded nothing less than the finest jewels. She spoke with calm precision, as though protocol could absolve her of what had transpired. Yet her composure did little to soften the truth. William laid bare: tradition is meaningless when it humiliates those who embody the monarchy's future. Catherine remained silent throughout, her dignity intact, even in discomfort. She did not need to speak. Her very presence underscored William's point. Here was a woman praised globally for her poise, forced into submission in her own home. The Guardian later described her silence as the most eloquent rebuke, noting that the contrast between her restraint and Camilla's assertion made the fracture impossible to ignore. What struck me most was Camilla's unyielding posture. She did not apologize. Instead, she doubled down, repeating that the crown required sacrifices and that appearances outweighed personal sentiment. It was a defense rooted not in empathy, but in ambition, the determination to secure her position as the unchallenged consort beside Charles. But ambition in monarchy is a double-edged sword. It can secure survival, but it can also corrode legitimacy. Mainstream reporting echoed this tension. Reuters framed the confrontation as a clash between duty and empathy, noting that William's defense of Catherine aligned with broader public expectations of a modern monarchy grounded in respect. Deutsche Welle pointed out that Camilla's reliance on protocol ignored the deeper truth that monarchy survives not through rules alone, but through trust. And Al Jazeera, in its characteristically blunt tone, called it a battle between past wounds and present power. For William, the cost of Camilla's ambition was clear. It reopened the wound of his mother's legacy, reminding him that Diana's memory was not just history, but a living measure of fairness. To see his wife diminished by the same institution that had once isolated his mother was intolerable. In that moment, his relationship with Camilla shifted from strained civility to open resistance. The staff felt the consequences almost immediately. Orders were more cautious instructions filtered through intermediaries, and whispers spread that William no longer trusted Camilla in matters touching Catherine or the children. The palace, so often a place of polished surfaces, now hummed with the quiet electricity of division. I reflected often on the symbolism. A tiara is meant to shine to reflect light, but here it had cast shadows. It revealed how easily ambition can warp tradition, how quickly respect can erode when empathy is absent. Camilla had won the moment she wore the tiara, stood beside Charles, and smiled for the cameras. But in winning, she had lost something greater. She had lost the trust of the heir and his family, a trust that no jewel could replace. In monarchy, ambition always carries a cost. Sometimes it is born quietly, hidden beneath ceremonies and smiles. Other times, as at Windsor, it reveals itself in sharp relief, undeniable and permanent. For Camilla, the cost was not measured in gems, but in relationships fractured in trust, diminished in a legacy tainted by overreach. And for William and Catherine, the confrontation became a line drawn in stone. Never again would they allow ambition to outweigh respect within their walls. Spin cycles, networks, backlash. The morning after Windsor, Camilla's advisors moved like clockwork. They understood that perception is everything, and they wasted no time in reshaping the story. Photographers were summoned to capture her at a literacy charity, laughing with children, her hands gently placed on their shoulders. A friendly columnist in the Telegraph published a piece praising her resilience, describing her as the quiet heart of the monarchy. The BBC, careful with its tone, highlighted her role as Charles's indispensable support. It was the same playbook she had relied upon for decades, soften the narrative, bury controversy under a tide of images, and frame her as indispensable. But this time, the spin faltered. Staff at Windsor had witnessed too much. Their whispers, leaked in fragments, passed quietly to reporters who already sensed a fracture. Reuters ran an analysis noting renewed questions about internal balance in the royal household. The Guardian focused on Catherine, calling her composure under pressure a study in dignity. Al Jazeera was blunt, reporting that the Queen Consort's reliance on precedence has collided with the modern expectations of respect and equality. Each article chipped away at the carefully built facade, leaving her team scrambling. Polls reflected the backlash. YouGov data showed an uptick in support for William and Catherine, particularly among younger generations. By contrast, Camilla's numbers stalled, even dipped slightly, despite the positive coverage her advisors tried to amplify. Social media was even harsher. Hashtags invoking Diana's memory trended again, with side-by-side images, Diana in her sapphire tiara, radiant and adored. Camilla in the same piece, framed as a usurper. It was the kind of comparison no PR strategy could neutralize. Inside the palace, her networks strained under the pressure. Courtiers who once defended her influence began to distance themselves. Some avoided meetings where her authority might be questioned. Others shifted their alignment subtly toward William and Catherine, sensing that the future of the crown was firmly in their hands. Even Charles seemed wearied, caught between loyalty to his wife and the uncomfortable reality that her ambition was eroding unity. Camilla herself carried on with practiced poise, her smile even brighter, her voice even warmer in public. But in private, I saw glimpses of defiance flicker across her face, the flash of someone who had fought too hard for too long to yield now. It reminded me of something the Times once wrote about her, that she survives not by conquering, but by outlasting. Yet Windsor showed the limits of outlasting. Endurance alone could not erase the dismay of staff or the silence of William. The backlash also exposed the fragility of her networks. They had always been transactional alliances of convenience rather than affection. They worked when her power seemed inevitable, when aligning with her carried no cost. But Windsor altered that balance. To stand too close to Camilla now was to risk alienation from the heir. And so her circle thinned. Not visibly, not all at once, but steadily, like sand slipping through fingers. I realized then that spin can buy time but not trust. Networks can shield but not forever. When ambition crosses into overreach, when personal assertion is cloaked as protocol, the palace itself begins to resist. The backlash against Camilla was not explosive. It was gradual, insidious, and relentless. Every headline, every poll, every whispered conversation in the corridors chipped away at the authority she had worked so hard to build. By the time the tiara was returned to Catherine's care, polished and restored to its case, the damage was already done. The jewel gleamed as it always had, but its symbolism had changed forever. It was no longer just a link between Diana and Catherine. It was now a reminder of Camilla's overreach, of the spin cycles that could not contain the backlash, and of the quiet isolation that even a crown could not disguise. Reckoning boundaries, what endures? The reckoning did not come with proclamations or scandalous headlines. It came with a quiet recalibration inside the palace. Charles, ever conscious of the institution's fragility, convened a private meeting where he addressed the matter without theatrics. Camilla would remain Queen Consort, her position secure by law and ceremony, but her influence would be more carefully bounded. Decisions regarding family heirlooms, personal jewels, and the stewardship of Diana's legacy would no longer pass through her hands. Instead, responsibility was redirected toward William and Catherine, signaling a subtle but profound shift in authority. Camilla accepted the outcome with the same practiced composure that had carried her through decades of scrutiny. She smiled in public, her words laced with graciousness, her schedule filled with charity engagements designed to emphasize continuity. But those closest to her could see the change. The corridors that once echoed with her influence grew quieter. Courtiers no longer rushed to her for guidance. The aura of inevitability that had surrounded her since the coronation was gone, replaced by a polite distance that spoke louder than words. The media framed the development cautiously. The BBC called it a restructuring of roles, careful not to stoke controversy. Reuters highlighted the generational transition, emphasizing how William and Catherine had emerged as the central figures of the monarchy's future. Al Jazeera described the adjustment as a concession to modern expectations of accountability, while Deutsche Welle noted that Diana's shadow, once thought to be fading, had returned to redefine the palace's boundaries. Public opinion reflected these narratives. Polling showed strong support for William and Catherine, while Camilla's rating stagnated, particularly among younger Britons who saw the tiara incident as proof of her overreach. For William, the reckoning was both personal and institutional. By defending Catherine, he not only protected his wife, but reaffirmed Diana's enduring presence in the monarchy. For Catherine, the return of the tiara was not just about jewels, it was about dignity, about reclaiming autonomy in a system that often demanded silence. Together, they emerged stronger symbols of stability and integrity, in contrast to the turbulence around them. Camilla's legacy, however, grew more complicated. She will be remembered as the woman who endured scandal and hostility to stand beside Charles as Queen Consort. But she will also be remembered for Windsor, for pressing too far, for confusing precedence with possession, for a moment of ambition that fractured trust. The tiara gleaming once more in Catherine's care became a reminder of both her endurance and her limits. What endures is paradox. Camilla still wears the crown, still fulfills her ceremonial duties, still smiles for the cameras. But beneath the surface, the palace has drawn firm boundaries. She is tolerated, perhaps even respected by some, but no longer trusted with the symbols that matter most. Her reign beside Charles is defined not by triumph, but by restraint, by the limits imposed after Windsor. And yet monarchy survives by learning from its fractures. The lesson here is clear: authority without empathy erodes legitimacy, and ambition, unchecked by respect, destroys unity. For all her endurance, Camilla could not escape that truth. Diana's shadow endures, carried forward in William, Catherine, and their children. Against that shadow, Camilla's role is smaller, bounded, a reminder that crowns may glitter, but they cannot outshine legacy. As I reflect, I think of the tiara itself, its sapphires deep as midnight, its diamonds sharp as ice. Once it symbolized continuity from Diana to Catherine, and then for a moment it became the center of conflict. Now restored to its rightful place, it endures as a warning. Symbols are fragile, and the respect they embody cannot be forced. That is what remains after Windsor. That is the legacy no amount of charm, no network of advisors, no polished smile can erase.